Usually, when we talk about climate change or, the environment, there's a pretty strict expectation of how that conversation is going to go.
Right, it's always policy debates.
Exactly.
Hmm.
We expect to look at carbon emission charts or dissect international treaties and measure sea level rise.
Yeah, the math of it all.
Right. The discussion is grounded entirely in the physical world. It's treated like this massive, complex math problem that humanity is just desperately trying to solve.
Oh, absolutely.
But then you encounter a perspective that takes all that modern data-driven anxiety and abruptly drops it right into the middle of the biblical apocalypse.
Which is quite the pivot.
It really is. Suddenly the charts vanish. The math is completely gone. And we're looking at a landscape where the forests are burning and the rivers are literally turning to blood.
I mean, it is the absolute definition of a jarring paradigm shift. Moving from standard UN-level environmentalism straight into ancient apocalyptic theology is a mental leap that, well, most people never make.
Yeah, not at all.
We are stripping away the entire scientific framing and stepping into a worldview where climate change isn't framed as an ecological crisis, but as a symptom of a deep spiritual rebellion.
Which is exactly why our mission today is to explore this highly specific, very provocative perspective with you. We are pulling all of this from an essay titled Environmentalism and Revelation, written by Joseph Bay.
It's a fascinating piece.
It really is. Bay starts his essay with what I can only really describe as a biblical riddle.
Oh, the Revelation stuff.
Exactly. He takes us straight to the book of Revelation, specifically chapters 8 and 16. And he points out a recurring theme in the end times judgments, like the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. During these periods, God unleashes catastrophic destruction, but it is specifically and repeatedly aimed at the environment. A third of the earth is burned up. A third of the trees are incinerated. All the green grass is just gone.
The imagery there is so brutal.
Oh, it's terrifying. And then it moves to the water. A third of the sea turns to blood, rivers and springs turn bitter, and massive amounts of marine life are just completely wiped out.
It paints a picture of deliberate, systemic ecological collapse orchestrated by the divine. It's relentless.
But here is the thing that struck Bay as an oddity, and I have to admit I thought the exact same thing when reading it.
Right.
If humanity's the one rebelling against the Creator, why take it out on the trees and the water?
It seems disconnected.
Exactly. If I'm mad at you and I go outside and key your car, I guess that makes a kind of vindictive sense. Or, if a dog bites someone, you hold the owner responsible.
Yeah, that tracks.
But you don't punish the dog for the owner's bad behavior. The trees and the rivers haven't committed any sins. They are completely innocent bystanders in all of this.
Well, Bay finds the answer to that exact tension not by looking forward to the apocalypse, but backward. He takes us to the book of Exodus, back to the 10 plagues of Egypt.
Okay, the plagues.
Right. He zeroes in on the very first plague, which is God striking the river Nile and turning it into blood. To understand Bay's logic, we have to ask why the Nile was targeted first.
I want to start with something else.
Exactly. I mean, the Egyptians obviously relied on the Nile for their agriculture and physical survival, but their relationship to the river went much deeper than mere utility. They didn't just use the Nile.
Oh, right. They worshipped it.
They did. They elevated it to the status of a deity. Egyptologists identify this water-bearer god as Hapi. So when God turns the Nile to blood, Bay argues he wasn't just, disrupting a water supply or destroying an economic resource.
He was attacking the god itself.
Exactly. It was a direct theological attack on their deity. And this historical event establishes Bay's core theological precedent, which is that God strikes nature when nature becomes an object of worship.
Wow.
If humanity elevates the created world to the status of a god, the creator destroys the idol to prove he is the one actually in charge.
That is a massive connection. Because if God punishes the idolization of a river in ancient Egypt, the logical leap Bay makes to our current era is pretty stark.
Oh, it's very stark.
He takes that historical pattern from Exodus and applies it directly to the modern environmental movement.
Yeah.
His central thesis is that the modern world worships the earth.
Right.
Whether you call it nature, the environment, or Gaia, he says it has become a literal idol. He anchors this by quoting Exodus chapter 34, verse 14, which explicitly states, God is a jealous God.
Yeah.
So, in Bay's theological framework, this modern reverence for the earth is a direct violation of the first commandment, and therefore it has to face judgment.
What's fascinating here is how Bay completely flips the script on environmentalism. He just strips away the entire veneer of science, economics, and policy.
It's not about the data anymore.
No, not at all. To him, this is not a debate over parts per million of carbon dioxide. It is a spiritual battle. He actually cites Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12.
Oh, the verse about spiritual forces.
Right. He argues that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, and spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
He even goes so far as to use the phrase climate cult.
He does.
He argues that protecting the Earth has transformed from a civic duty into this deeply entrenched, heavily enforced religious dogma. And when you look at the mechanisms of modern climate activism through Bay's lens, you start to see the parallels he's drawing.
Yeah, the behavior patterns.
Right. He points out that questioning the media narrative on climate change is practically forbidden. It carries the weight of a taboo. If you push back on the timeline or the severity of the crisis, you aren't just viewed as factually incorrect.
You're a heretic.
Exactly. You are treated like a heretic being excommunicated from polite society.
And he observes the fervent behavior of the movement, too. The doomsday prophesying, the purity tests regarding personal carbon footprints, and the way the lives and livelihoods of man are routinely disrupted or, in his words, trampled on.
Yeah, for the sake of the cause.
Right. He views these not as political activism, but as the literal hallmarks of religious devotion. To Bay, carbon taxes and lifestyle restrictions look remarkably like making sacrifices to appease a newly resurrected Earth deity.
It's such an intense way to frame it. But if environmentalism is functioning as a modern religion, Bay has a very sharp critique of its specific doctrines.
Right, the actual teachings.
He doesn't just think it's misguided. He argues the absolute defining doctrine of this climate cult is profoundly anti-human.
Yes, the antinatalist angle.
Exactly. He points to this growing sentiment within the movement that humanity itself is essentially a disease on the planet. He gives these jarring examples, like students being openly taught in classrooms to consider not having children.
Which is wild.
And the reasoning given to these kids is entirely mathematical. They're told that not having a child prevents 9,441 tons of carbon dioxide emissions.
Reducing the entirety of human life, human potential, and legacy down to a single metric of pollution is just a crucial pivot in his argument.
Right.
He highlights rhetoric where activists openly refer to humans as a cancer disease to the Earth. And this isn't isolated to fringe manifestos either.
No, it's everywhere.
Bay shows how deeply this antinatalist, anti-human mindset bleeds into mainstream pop culture. He points to the apocalyptic, disruptive messaging of the Extinction Rebellion movement.
Oh, yeah.
He mentions the film First Reformed, where a pastor's faith is literally consumed and destroyed by ecological despair.
He even points to the Thanos meme.
Yes, the Thanos meme.
I mean, we've all seen it. This pervasive internet joke that the Marvel villain who wiped out half the universe to save the remaining resources actually had the right idea.
Thanos did nothing wrong.
Exactly. Bay sees that meme not just as dark internet humor, but as a genuine symptom of a society that subconsciously views human existence as a net negative. A society that fundamentally believes less humanity equals a better Earth.
Well, calling humans a cancer is a direct inversion of the biblical concept of the imago Dei, the belief that humans are made in the image of God.
That's a huge clash.
It really is. If the Bible teaches that humans are the pinnacle of creation meant to flourish, and the dominant cultural narrative teaches that humans are a plague that should stop reproducing to save the climate, those two worldviews are completely irreconcilable.
Yeah, they can't coexist.
They can't. And this is why Bay concludes that at its core, the environmentalist message goes far beyond a policy disagreement. He actually labels it fundamentally satanic, diametrically opposed to the Bible's view of human worth.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because reading this, my immediate hang-up was about the practical application.
Right.
If Bay thinks caring about carbon emissions is an idolatrous, anti-human, false religion, does that give people a theological excuse to just trash the planet?
That's the logical next question.
Right. Does he actually think we should just throw our garbage out the car window and exploit the Earth until it burns?
Well, Bay is very careful to close that loophole. He explicitly includes a caveat for biblical stewardship. He maintains that Christians are called to be responsible stewards of the environment.
Okay, that's important.
Very important. He specifically mentions doing our part in basic things like recycling and not being wasteful with resources. He is definitely not advocating for malicious destruction or corporate exploitation or total apathy toward nature.
So he does believe in recycling.
Yeah.
That is a massive, really important clarification. But he draws a huge impassable boundary between stewardship and environmentalism.
Yes, he does. Stewardship, in Bay's view, means managing and caring for a resource while recognizing that it ultimately belongs to God, and that its purpose is to serve humanity.
Right.
He believes the modern movement has sprinted miles past that boundary. By adopting antinatalist rhetoric and treating the preservation of the earth as the highest possible moral good, the movement has subordinated humanity to nature.
It's flipped the hierarchy.
Exactly. To Bay, one worldview is divine order and the other is demonic inversion.
This profound disconnect brings us to Bay's deep frustration with the modern church. Because if there is this massive spiritual war raging over the fundamental value of humanity versus the earth, Bay feels like his fellow Christians are entirely missing the plot.
Oh, he's very critical.
Extremely. He is particularly scathing toward modern pulpits. He calls out preachers who, instead of preaching the gospel, are routinely preaching environmentalism to their congregations. He literally calls this madness.
Madness.
He views it as the church just playing a supporting role in the world's idolatry instead of offering a biblical alternative.
And to understand what Bay thinks the church should be doing, we have to look at his proposed alternative to environmentalism. He looks all the way back to the beginning of the biblical narrative.
To the Garden of Eden.
Yes, the Garden of Eden. For Bay, the Eden bottle is the ultimate God-ordained blueprint for how humanity should relate to the natural world. He points directly to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, where God gives Adam and Eve their primary mandate.
The famous verse.
Right. He tells them to be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, and subdue it. They are instructed to rule over every living creature.
Subdue it is an incredibly strong phrase.
It is.
It implies authority, active management, and bringing something under control. It is a completely different paradigm from the modern environmentalist ideal of leave no trace or, preserving untouched wilderness. Bay is saying humanity is supposed to leave a footprint.
Yeah, in Bay's theological view, a garden is not wild, untamed nature. A garden is a nature brought into man's submission. It is architected, cultivated, and designed specifically for the benefit and enjoyment of humanity in accordance with God's will. Nature is supposed to serve human flourishing.
Which is the total opposite of the current narrative.
Exactly. The modern environmental movement argues that man's highest good is to step back and let nature be wild. Bay's reading of Genesis argues that man's highest good is to step forward and actively order nature into a garden.
It's a fundamental clash over the actual purpose of the planet, and Bay takes this logic to its absolute limit when looking at the future. Because if you truly believe this biblical narrative, it completely nullifies the goals of modern climate activism.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Bay's ultimate conclusion is that no amount of carbon emission reductions, international treaties, or systemic overhauls can stop the inevitable.
That's unavoidable.
Totally unavoidable. The burning of the trees, the oceans turning to blood, the massive ecological tribulations described in Revelation Bay believes those events are divinely ordained. They are on a set schedule. The earth must face those judgments to cleanse the idolatry we discussed earlier.
So trying to save this current Earth from destruction is not just practically impossible for Bay, it's a theological distraction. It's trying to preserve a temporary fallen system.
Exactly. For Bay, the complete total realization of God's perfect plan, that Eden-like harmony between God, humanity, and nature, will never be achieved by human policy.
Right.
It will only happen when God himself creates the new heaven and new earth.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at the burning forests in the book of Revelation. We traced the psychology of idolatry back to the plagues of Egypt and the worship of the river god Hapi.
Yeah.
We unpacked how modern climate anxiety, carbon footprints, and antinatalism are viewed by Bay as a secular religion. And we ended up in the Garden of Eden, looking at a mandate to subdue the earth.
It is a massive sweep of history, theology, and cultural critique. And it forces you to view familiar headlines through a radically different lens.
Understanding this specific text is incredibly valuable, regardless of your own beliefs, because it maps out how deeply held theology fundamentally shapes global policy perspectives.
Absolutely.
If someone operates from Bay's framework, they aren't looking at a climate treaty and debating the merits of economic models or solar subsidies. They are looking at that treaty and seeing a spiritual battle. They are seeing the codified worship of Gaia.
Right.
You simply cannot understand or engage with their political stance unless you understand the theological engine driving it.
Bay ends his essay with a direct plea to his fellow Christians. He urges them to stay awake and to recognize and resist the spirit of the age.
which makes sense given his argument.
Yeah. He quotes 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 4 and 5, which discusses using divine power to demolish strongholds and tearing down arguments and presumptions set up against the knowledge of God. He views resisting the environmentalist narrative not as political stubbornness, but as an active, necessary form of spiritual warfare.
It leaves us with a fascinating, almost uncomfortable tension. Bay explicitly says Christians should be good stewards, they should recycle, and not be wasteful. But he simultaneously insists the biblical mandate is to subdue the earth for human benefit, and that viewing human activity as a cancer is satanic.
This raises an important question, something for you to mull over as you go about your day.
I love this.
Bay argues that reducing carbon emissions cannot stop biblical inevitabilities, and that environmentalism has crossed into idolatry. But if the biblical mandate is also to be a faithful steward of the earth, at what point does using modern technology to try and fix the climate cross the line?
Right.
Where exactly is the boundary between being a responsible manager trying to cultivate the earth and falling into the very environmental idolatry that Bay warns against? Who decides when stewardship becomes worship?
When you introduce this apocalyptic theological lens, the math of climate change just disappears. The clean, manageable charts vanish. Suddenly, whether you're trying to lower a carbon footprint, deciding whether to have children, or just talking about the future of the planet, you're navigating deeply held beliefs about human worth, divine judgment, and the end of the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.